Welcome to Magalia Rose Studio. I have a question. Are you a control painter? Whether beginning, experienced, have you wanted to express more freedom in your paintings? I've sometimes had to let go of my tendency to try to control watercolor, and this demonstration video shows a fun way that I often use to loosen up by using mineral paper along with watercolor, bold lines of black India ink, and a fine spray of isopropyl alcohol. If you grew up carefully coloring within the lines, it's time to try something new. Here are a few examples of wild and bold grapes and a photo of two of my grape paintings that I have decorating my kitchen. Let's take a look. You may be able to use colors that you already have on your palette, so don't run out and buy a color just because it's mentioned in a class or video. I'm a big believer in using a limited palette and knowing what each color can accomplish alone or with other colors on the palette. So check your palette and see what you have that might work. The colors I will be using are alizarin crimson, quinacridone violet, sap green, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna. That's the only colors that we'll need, and again, substitute as necessary, and I don't usually depend on one brand. I find the color of each brand that I prefer, so again, don't necessarily go with advertising, go with what you have tried and found tried and true. Let's move on to the supplies that I use for this painting demonstration. That would include a 9x12 piece of mineral paper, a number B graphite pencil for the tracing. The only brush I use is a number 12 round watercolor brush. I also use a dropper to activate my paints rather than dropping from a brush and possibly dirtying it. I have a 1 ounce bottle of the Dr. P.H. Martin's Black Star waterproof black India ink, a fine mist spray bottle of either 70 or 91% alcohol. I have a test piece of watercolor paper to test my colors, a towel, and don't forget to have 2 containers of clear water. One is for cleaning your brush and the other is for mixing your paints. Now let's go ahead and trace the template onto our mineral paper and get that painting getting ready to start. Now I'm going to trace my template drawing of a bunch of grapes onto a 9x12 sheet of mineral paper using a number B pencil, which is softer than a number 2. It will make darker lines so that I don't lose my lines under the darker watercolor washers. I'm just going to use an old-fashioned light box here so that I can make tracing pretty easy to happen. Now, I don't want you to be too exacting on this. You don't have to follow every line. You can just simply relax a little bit. Those pencil marks really will add to the feeling of spontaneity in the drawing. Now, if you don't want to spend time designing your own drawing of a bunch of grapes with leaves, it's okay to trace or quick sketch from a photograph, as long as it is either your own personal photo or a non-copyrighted image. Online websites such as pixabay.com and splash.com, as well as others, have many free, non-copyrighted images available to download. So you can use those, come up with a nice template so that you can reuse it over and over again in case this particular painting doesn't work out. You'll have options to do others, and it's much easier and time-saving if you do it that way. So let's get this traced onto here, and then I think we'll be about ready to paint. Now I've traced the template image onto my piece of mineral paper, And as we've talked about that, even though that this is thin, it doesn't need to be taped down. It just can lay on any support board that you use. I happen to often use an old piece of foam core board that I've covered completely with packing tape. This makes a very light, waterproof, and inexpensive support board, so as they become stained or overused, you can discard them without feeling that you've really wasted a lot of money. Now I want to talk about activating the colors on your palette. There are many types of palettes that we can use out there. Many of them have little individual cubbies for each of the watercolors. Those are fine. I do have some of those and do use them, but for the most part I'm happier with just a butcher's tray in which I can line up the colors that I use. The reason I like the butcher's tray is I'm pretty much a sloppy painter, and this makes it very easy for me to clean off my colors and keep them as clean as possible. Now, to activate the colors I simply use a dropper and just a couple of drops. I'm going to go ahead and activate my ultramarine blue, and here's a few drops on the quinacridone violet, and then lastly I'm going to put a few drops onto my alizarin crimson. As a rule, only activate the colors you're going to use. Every time you wet a color and it dries, the binding material, which is gum arabic, evaporates. If you have any cracking with your watercolors, that usually means that you have been adding water and they have dried out. So it's something to be aware of. Don't over moisturize, and don't just simply use a spray bottle to activate everything if you're not going to use it. My paint colors have been activated, and before you ever use your watercolor brush, make sure you rinse it in clear water and dry it off so it's a damp brush. I do this for two reasons. It's more willing to accept the paint, and sometimes I've been known to put away a brush that's not completely clean, and this will tell me if I'm going to contaminate any colors with an unclean brush. So that done, I'm going to start with the alizarin crimson. We'll pretend that these are flame seedless grapes. So I'm going to begin, and I'm just going to very loosely come in here with the alizarin crimson, and I can make more intense alizarin if I want a shadow area. Now you can pretty much go around to several of the grapes at a time. My suggestion is white is a friend here, so don't make every boundary border meet. Go ahead and put in the grapes. Don't worry about the pencil marks. That's not going to be an issue. I'm going to go ahead and do, let's do some over here, and one more grape here. Okay. Now, as you can see, I have kind of left the white areas. I'm going to go ahead and pull that in a little closer for you. Okay. Now I'm going to put in a little bit of the quinacridone violet. You can mix your own purple violet, again with the alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue, and make a beauty. But right now I'm being a little bit lazy, I admit it, and I'm using a pre-made purple. And don't brush. This is sort of a key here. Just drop the color in and let it move around. And pick a one side or an area to be sort of your shadow if it's underneath another grape. Okay. If you want to do a little bit of a lift just to make a lighter side, that's fine. I'm going to let those sit for a little bit, and I'm going to move on to another area. And I'm going to do exactly about the same thing. If you want more blue grapes, that type of thing, just use more of the ultramarine blue with the alizarin crimson. You can get quite blue. But for the sake of simplicity today, I am just going to pretty much make all my flame seedless about the same colors. And here I have another 3. And I'm going to add again a little bit of that quin violet. Be sure to leave white. You're going to understand why in just a moment. Now you can hold your palette up, or pardon me, your paper up to the light, and you should be seeing areas starting to dry a little bit. I'm going to let this dry a little bit more and continue with a few more grapes down in this area. And what's going to happen is we're going to be adding some India ink, waterproof black India ink. And I use the Dr. P.H. Martin. He has several high carb. He has the matte. I use the matte. Usually it avoids reflection. Now this is where we're going to start getting a little bit wild and crazy. I'm going to examine with the direction of the light which of my grapes are starting to have a dry edge here and there. And what I'm going to do in this will give you an idea of how this process works. I have a piece of test paper here, and I'm not even going to use a brush or a pen with the ink. I'm going to take the ink, and it comes with a dropper. And I'm going to make sure there's no ink in the dropper, pat it a little bit, and then I'm going to sort of tap it onto this paper. And what's going to happen is you are going to be able to see some lines of varying thickness. Sometimes some sides with more ink on them will be thicker and others will be thinner. And I advise every time you dip it, you check it before you put it on your paper. Okay, I'm about ready to do a little bit more inking on these lower grapes. They are pretty much 1/2 to 2/3 area dry. So again, I'm going to, it's pretty thick there, so I want it thinner. So I'm just going to come ahead and, again, notice you just kind of flip this ink around. Don't get too particular on how it's going to land. You can always come back afterwards and make corrections. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on with the painting, and I will be back and join you. I will probably speed most of that up. Now I've gone ahead and put some ink on some of the grapes while they were still wet, and you can see the running, which is always very interesting. Most of them have dried, and I'm just going to go ahead and see if there are a few other places I want to define where the grapes begin and end. And you're not going to outline every single grape. That's not the goal. The goal is to sort of trick your viewer's eye into them interpreting where things start and finish, and not have it all just perfectly laid out for the viewer of the work. This gives it that sense of freedom, and it's kind of difficult at first to wrap your head around getting that sense of freedom, but it's paper. You can use the back of the mineral paper. It's inexpensive, so there's not a whole lot to be lost. So now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the leaves. And for the leaves, we're going to be doing a little bit differently. For the leaves, I'm going to use pretty much the same very relaxed attitude toward applying the paint. I'm going to be using sap green, a little bit possibly of burnt sienna, and ultramarine blue. Again, I'm going to first apply the paint. And again, leave white. Don't have a fear that the white's going to interfere. It's simply going to add to the interest. I like this sap. It's pretty bright. It's the Daniel Smith sap green. And I'm going to go ahead and drop in a little tiny bit of burnt sienna. And for those shadow areas, I'm going to have a little bit of the ultramarine blue mixed with a bit of the sap green to make a little darker green. I don't want to go too dark. I want these pretty bright. And now what I'm going to do is rinse my brush, and I'm going to apply isopropyl alcohol in a very fine mist spray bottle. This is 91%, 70% will work also. And just in case there's some wet areas here, I'm going to shield them and spray the leaf. And you can see that fun effect that we have going on there. And I'm just going to leave that and go on to the next leaf. And I'm going to skip so that there's not a whole lot of running together going on. Allow time for those colors to blend, mix, the alcohol to give texture and interest. And again, a little bit of the burnt sienna here and there. Again, if you throw a little bit of something too much, just wiggle around with it. You do know that the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue will make a nice dark, rich color, so you're always assured that that's going to be okay. The burnt sienna simply grays down the brightness of the green. This leaf might be casting a bit of a shadow. Let's go with that. Okay. And again, I'm going to protect this leaf, get my alcohol, and spray from about, almost a foot up. And now I'm going to go ahead and let those dry. Now I'm not going to be applying ink to the leaves until all the leaves are completed and dry. But I'm going to go ahead, and since this one is mostly dry, I'm going to do one more quick demonstration of painting the leaf. Again, this is the Daniel Smith sap green. I'm getting a little bit of darker tone. You can touch some of these, don't worry, because the ink is going to do a lot of the work here. Your job is just to literally slap that paint on there. Make your little points. And again, use the biggest brush you need to use to get the job done. That's my usual way of looking at what brush. For this entire painting, all I am using is a number 12 round watercolor brush. Buy the best brush you can afford, but don't try to get a brush that is extremely expensive simply for the sake that it's expensive and you think it's going to make you a better painter. That's not necessarily how things work. Get a reasonable brush, but you don't necessarily have to have the $150 sable. As you notice, this leaf I've gone a little bit darker on. There's a little shade from the grape bunch itself, as well as the leaf above. I'm going to go ahead and apply the alcohol. Here we go. Here's my spray bottle if you wanted to see that. And everything's pretty dry, so there we go. And I'm going to let that dry, and then I will be continuing on doing all the leaves, and I will speed that up for you, and then I will come back. The grape leaves have now all been painted, and they're mostly dry. There are a few damp spots toward the center, but I'm going to go ahead forward with using some of the ink in the very same manner that I did the grapes themselves. I have my dropper. I make sure it's not too full of ink. And I'm just going to come over to the leaf, and I'm just going to loosely outline. You can go ahead and put a few veins in. The key here is, again, do not just trace all the way around. If you see areas that need definition, such as when the two leaves meet, yeah, you can go ahead and add a little bit there. Make sure to make some little pointy corners on the leaves. And I like to, again, come into the center. This is just an exercise in seeing how relaxed you can be. And you can always come back when it's completely dry and add a few lines if you think they're necessary. This is just the chance to have some crazy stuff going on that you hadn't planned on. It's a great way of getting to understand that watercolor doesn't always do what you think it's supposed to do, but don't always second guess it. Sometimes it comes up with some really amazing things. Okay, I think we've pretty much done it for the leaves and the ink, so we're going to leave that be for now. When we come back, what we're going to be doing is putting in our branches, some work with the burnt sienna and our little tendrils, and then pretty much the painting's going to be done, so not much left to do. The ink and watercolor on the leaves is completely dry, and I'm going to go ahead and work on the stems and adding a few little details with the burnt sienna. I've activated the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna, but I also activated the sap green a little bit. I might drop that in a few places if I feel that that might be fun. So I'm going to go ahead and remember, burnt sienna and ultramarine blue together make a very nice, rich, dark brown. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the burnt sienna. And I'm going to lay that into this branch. I'm also going to have my alcohol ready because I think I'm going to want some texture here. When you reach the end of the branch, don't just make a straight end like that. Go ahead and flick it up so that the imagination will carry that branch further out. And I'm going to bring that down here. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean my brush off a little bit, and I'm going to get some ultramarine blue, and I'm just going to gently put that into some of this lower area of the burnt sienna. Now it looks blue, correct? We're going to fix that. I'm going to clean my brush, and I'm going to get a more concentrated dab of burnt sienna on my brush, and I'm going to kind of wiggle that into the blue. Make sure that the branch isn't straight, you don't have straight edges, that you're allowing it to kind of wiggle and be rough. You've seen grapevines. Gets a little bit larger also as it heads toward the main stem. So now I have this done. I'm going to go ahead and put this little bit of burnt sienna down into the leaf, and then I'm just going to gently pull a little bit of burnt sienna into almost all the leaves where that main vein that comes off the stem comes down into the actual leaf structure. This bottom leaf here needs a little bit of I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my alcohol spray right here on this upper stem. And the same thing, everything else is dry, so I'm not going to worry too much. And about, again, 12 inches, and I'm going to just give one quick spray and you can see how that texture is starting to develop. I'm going to let all of my work with the burnt sienna dry completely, and then we're going to be on pretty much close to the final step, in which I will be inking a little bit of detail into that branch and some of the little sub branches and adding the little tendrils. And then finally, after that is all dry, we're going to deal with a little bit of blowing of watercolor action down here at the total base. So this is a real fun part. So go ahead, let's take a few minutes and let that dry. The paint on the upper branch is all dry, completely dry now, and I only let it dry before adding the ink in this because it's a smaller area and I don't want a lot of dark coming in there. So I have my ink ready and my dropper, and again I make sure that the dropper doesn't have too much ink on it. And I simply add a few quick lines of the ink. And now I'm going to go ahead, and we have these little tendrils, and I'm just going to kind of follow the pencil mark as best as I can and put in those tendrils. Okay, I have a piece of the mineral paper here and a bulb blower that you can get at the craft stores and online, and also a bent flexible straw that you actually use with the bend at the bottom. And the largest problem people have when they're blowing watercolor around the paper is not using a wet enough mix. It has to be dark enough to see and it has to be wet enough to move. So it's just something that can take practice. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of green in here. And I'm going to use this little blower bulb, and just, if you want to tip the paper slightly on your support board, that can sometimes get it to move even more. So you can see how this goes. I can do a quick close-up on that. Okay. Now another method that's often used, and that was the first method I learned in one of my watercolor classes, is to use a straw, a flex straw. And it's the same principle. We're going to make a nice puddle of watercolor. I'm going to tip the board slightly, and I'm going to just use the straw and blow. And you're getting a very similar effect. So we can use either of those methods, and I think I may use them both. I'm not sure, but I'm going to go ahead and bring on the painting, and let's see what we can do for fun. I've mixed a large puddle of the sap green and ultramarine blue with just a dab of burnt sienna in there to make a very dark, rich green. And I'm going to go ahead and just put that in here under the grapes and the leaves, this puddle. And now I'm going to go ahead and take that bulb blower and start to move that paint. I'm going to tip the board a little bit. And now while that's quite wet, to make it a little darker in there, I'm going to go ahead and put in a little bit of the, just dropping in a little burnt sienna and a little bit of the ultramarine blue. And just sort of squiggle it in there. You don't have to go up. Remember our vow to not obliterate white. It's not necessary. And you can blow it more, you can leave it, you can move it a little bit if you want. Just kind of relax with this. It's kind of fun to watch it. If you feel that it's too dark at any place, well, it's nice and wet, rinse off your brush, dry it on a towel a little bit so it's just damp, and you can pick up some of that moisture and redistribute it. blower also will just move paint around just for fun. Experiment. This is part of what's fun about it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and continue and do some of this blowing of puddles around the leaves for another minute, and I'll be back with the completed painting. I've put a simple working mat around the painting, and always have some pieces of mat board around if possible, or even construction paper, so that you can put them around your painting, because it makes a big difference in evaluating what your final product is. I'm pretty happy. It looks like most of my others. A few differences because I just have to have a little bit of fun. So give it a try. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you come back to Miguel Rose Studio, which is your free online watercolor classroom. See you next time.